Well, here's a part of the lecture that I know you all enjoy. The mid-century body ideal. Let's take a look at her. And there she is, the Hourglass Returns. When did we last see the Hourglass figure? You remember, right? At the turn of the century. Do you remember Miss Camille Clifford? She would have been a huge hit in the 1950s. Small sloping shoulders, large, very pointed breasts, a cinched waist, voluptuous hips, and of course this hourglass body was enhanced by the new silhouette in clothing, which we'll talk about in a bit. Did anyone have an hourglass figure such as this in the 1950s? They sure did, and it was their hourglass figures that made them so famous. People that you may have heard of, like Marilyn Monroe. Of course, she had that perfect hourglass figure. So did Elizabeth Taylor. She had been a child star in the 1940s, but come the 50s she had blossomed, quite literally, into this very shapely, large-breasted woman. This movie star here, Jayne Mansfield, you may not have heard of her. She was a bit on the tacky side, sort of a B movie star. Kind of famous for being famous, actually famous for having really, really big boobs. This is why Jayne Mansfield became a star, during a decade obsessed with the breast, and we will find out why in a second. And Jayne Mansfield, she knew how to work the paparazzi to get attention and publicity. It was so odd, whenever she was out in public at, I don't know, a movie premiere or something, and stepping onto the red carpet, how did it always happen? But whoops, her boob would fall out, just as the paparazzi were taking her picture. Oh, and then she would be seen, you know, going out to a fancy dinner or gala ball, walking up the stairs, and whoops, her boob would fall out, just as the paparazzi were taking her picture. Not the classiest of people. She was killed in an automobile accident driving her pink convertible Cadillac down Hollywood Boulevard. Brigitte Bardot, you see, this is an international body ideal. She had this hourglass figure. And so did Sophia Loren. It transpires that a few of these ladies turned out to be very talented actresses. Elizabeth Taylor, for example, and Sophia Loren. Marilyn Monroe, that's up for grabs. Some people think she was a great actress, others don't. I think she sort of was. Jayne Mansfield and Brigitte Bardot could not act their way out of a paper bag, but it doesn't matter. That's not why they were famous. They were famous for having this body. And who else do we associate with the 50s? Who else came to life in the 50s who had this figure? Barbie. Barbie had this ideal figure. It was about a return to femininity after the war. Women had to adopt very masculine roles during the war, remember? And this masculinity was reflected, wasn't it, in those big shoulders of the 1940s. Suddenly it was all about a return to femininity, to womanliness. A focus on the family meant that the breast became really the erogenous zone again. We associate breasts with many things, but one of them is motherhood. So it was all about a return to femininity. It was about men and women adopting their traditional roles. But if you didn't have this body naturally, you could achieve a proximity of it with one of these, girdles. The difference between a girdle and a corset is that a girdle is something you pull on. In fact, you had to roll these on. You would roll them down to make sort of a ring. You'd step into the ring and then you would roll it over your body. Girdles you roll, corsets you either lace or hook to close them. Some women did wear corsets in the 1950s and early 60s, but really it was the girdle. And this one, you can see her bra beneath it with this very pointy breast. Look like this, feel like this. Now you can be 3 inches slimmer in the famous Walk Easy girdle. I don't think anyone's going to be walking too easily in that thing. Here is another image of a girdle. This one has the bra built into it. These were extremely tight and extremely uncomfortable. I don't know if any of you have worn Spanx ever. I have. And boy, after a day in Spanx, you can't wait to take them off. They're so uncomfortable. These were so much more uncomfortable than Spanx. And everybody wore them. Because they worked. Look at this. Before and after. Before this lady slips into her girdle, or doesn't slip into her girdle, fights her way into the girdle. And then after. See what it did? Undercover strategy for new glamour. Look at these. These are separate girdles and bras, and these girdles, the one on the right goes all the way to the knees. And you're thinking, why do you need a girdle to go all the way to your knees when skirts were so full? Well, not all skirts were full. Some were very tight pencil skirts. We're going to look at the two main silhouettes of the 1950s in a second. But these are not comfortable, and as you can see, women's stockings would attach directly to their girdles. This is the era before tights. Tights happened in the 60s. And everybody wore a girdle. You would have worn a girdle. I would have worn a girdle. It didn't matter how skinny you were, because it wasn't about being skinny. It was about being curved and pulled in tightly at the waist. Everybody would have worn a girdle. If you didn't wear a girdle, that was not good. You were sort of slovenly if you didn't wear a girdle. People would notice if you didn't have a girdle on. It wasn't ladylike, it was sloppy. But you needed to wear one because look at these shapes. Basically, mid-century fashion simply didn't work without a girdle. As we saw a few seconds ago, there was a huge interest in the breasts in the 1950s. Return to femininity, motherhood, women back in the home, etc. Basically, the bigger and more pointy your boobs, the better it was. That was the answer to everything. Big, pointy, high boobs. Like hers. Oh, and there's Jayne Mansfield again. You can see why she was famous for her breasts. Here is a more modified, less ridiculous type of breast than Jayne Mansfield's, but you can see how very, very pointy they are. So the obsession with breasts is understandable. The era saw a return to heightened femininity and womanliness, and also breasts are maternal. So this tied in with the obsession for family. I've already said that, but I wrote it up here so that when you review this PowerPoint, you will remember. But why the cone shape? Yeah, I get why they were big, but why this weird cone shape? Like this. Well, here's a theory. What was the other big obsession of the 1950s? It was space. The space race. The world was obsessed with rocket ships. So look at that rocket ship, and then look at the girl and her boobs on the right. Don't you think that those cone shapes look a little bit like the head of a rocket? Interesting. Fashion is not an island. It's always a response. But what if you simply couldn't throw a swell front? Do you remember when we read that expression when we were doing the turn of the century on that joke postcard, throw a swell front? Well, what if you couldn't throw a swell front naturally? Well, then you would insert falsies, these little padded false boobs into your bra. So you'd buy a bra a couple of sizes too large, and then you'd put your falsies in. There were some ridiculous alternatives to artificially enhancing your bust. Look at this. Do it yourself. The blow-up bra. You'd put your bra on, and then you would blow into a little tube and inflate your boobs. Like this lady is doing here. How utterly ridiculous, but it shows you the importance placed upon breasts, upon having this hourglass figure. And I think it must have really affected some people terribly. Look at this, some sort of con run in a local paper here. Full of bosom, become desirous, enjoy new romantic triumphs. Highly successful methods. You sent your money away and God knows what they sent you. Oh, an easy-to-follow 64-page booklet. And no booklet is going to enhance your breasts, is it? So I think that this really did sort of feed into a lot of insecurities for women who didn't naturally have large breasts. Skinny girls are not glamour girls. Well, that's good news for me. But you can see this obsession with curves. Good news for thousands of girls who have no sex appeal. Thousands gain 10 to 25 pounds quick with ionized yeast. You see, it wasn't about being skinny. You had to have a tiny waist. But that tiny waist was no good unless you had that curve to go with it. The large breasts and the large rounded hips. But what if no amount of inflatable bras or ionized yeast could help you throw a swell front? Who could you turn to for inspiration? Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn really was the poster girl for flat-chested ladies. They had somebody they could turn to for inspiration who was beautiful and famous and glamorous, but you know what? Even Audrey wore falsies at the start of her career. Take a look at that. The dominant fashion idea. Well, the mid-century actually had three silhouettes. The hourglass, this long and tapered silhouette, and then this, slim and boxy. Let's break it down. A small hat. Remember, this era was all about rules, a return to propriety after the chaos of war, uniformity. Set hair, we'll look at hair in a second, but hair was always set with curlers, always very neat, tiny sloping shoulders, tight sleeves, a cinched waist, gloves, an enormous full skirt, a long hemline. Remember, we're going to look at why the new look happened, but you remember how skirts got shorter in the war years because of rationing, right? It's natural that when rationing desisted, that skirts would drop. That makes sense. And then pointy-toed stilettos or kitten-heeled shoes. That's your first silhouette. On the second silhouette, everything's the same apart from a tight pencil skirt. And on the third silhouette, this boxy jacket, cardigan, or sweater, this very boxy look with the slim skirt. These are the main three silhouettes of the mid-century era. So many of you have told me that you like it when I do the beauty ideal best. Guess what? I like doing it the best too. It's my favorite bit. There she is again. All right, let's transform our lovely, pretty, generic friend here into the pinnacle of 1950s beauty. It starts with very thick eyebrows. You know how I love to analyze fashion and why it happens the way that it does. I have still yet to come up with a reason for the thick eyebrows of the 50s. Maybe we can discuss it in a discussion board or something, and you can give me your theories. So, big, thick eyebrows. And if you didn't have naturally thick eyebrows, what did you do? Well, you'd pencil them in. And then we see very bright eyeshadow. These new colors. Do you remember? It was all about newness in the 50s. So, think about how these new colors we were seeing, turquoise and seafoam and corals, of course, they would translate to makeup. And then what really marks the mid-century era is, of course, the cat eye. Why was that popular? I think you figured it out. It changed the shape of the eye. It gave the eye a new shape. This era was obsessed with new shapes, the boomerang shape, the starburst shape, of course, a new shape for the eyes, and then false eyelashes. All of the attention in mid-century makeup is on the upper lid of the eye. And then rouge in one of those lovely new coral shades. And primarily a dark lip throughout the 50s, and as we move into the early 60s, we see coral tones, lighter tones in the lip. And then we'll give her a 1950s hairdo, and voila, she's Audrey Hepburn. So many of these movie star looks really were created with makeup, you know. Not that Audrey Hepburn wasn't a beautiful woman without it. Of course she was, but makeup really gave her her quintessential look, didn't it? But this look with the thick eyebrows was across the board. There's Elizabeth Taylor. She was another beauty icon that everybody wanted to look like. As was she, and you can see that turquoise eyeshadow there, and the cat eye. You should probably know who this beautiful flame-head woman is. Her name is Suzy Parker, and she was really the first supermodel. What makes somebody famous in fashion? I always think somebody knows they've made it when their name is known outside of the industry. And in this era, everybody knew who Suzy Parker was. She was from Texas, and she was beautiful, tall and healthy and fabulous, with this very elegant, sophisticated face, because, of course, the 50s was all about sophistication, a return to propriety, all about being very grown up and sophisticated. That's how she looked until she opened her mouth, and she had the thickest Texan drawl. It was really quite charming. She tried to break into movies, but the first time she appeared on screen in a big budget movie, she appeared in the frame looking absolutely stunning, opened her mouth to speak some dialogue, and the whole audience burst out laughing. So poor Suzy Parker. Do you recognize her? We've already met this talented philanthropist. That's Josephine Baker in the 1950s. And look at her eye makeup. You see, this was a universal look, but you all know about the cat eye anyway because it's come back, hasn't it? The interest in new and futuristic shapes goes to the head, quite literally. Hair became short. Really, it was a reaction to all of the long hair that we saw in the 1940s that was done in elaborate coifs because hair wasn't rationed. Hair becomes short, it's always set, and we see these new shapes come into play. I don't think it's very flattering hair, but people did love it. This is rather nice, though, but you see it's a new shape. It's all about shape. That's kind of a ridiculous shape, but wait. By the time we get to the early 60s, this obsession with shape reached new heights. Literally. Look at that, and look at that. So you can see there is no way you would mistake any of these hairdos for the victory roles of the 1940s, is there? Time to move to the designer of the decade. Our first designer of the decade. And I've got a feeling you're going to know who it is. It's this rather cute-looking guy here. Do you know who he is? Of course, he's Christian Dior. And in 1947, he created this, the New Look. The 50s is important in terms of Paris reclaiming its stranglehold over fashion, at least for the following decade. Obviously, fashion suffered terribly during the war because Paris was occupied. Hitler tried to move the fashion industry to Berlin and tried to encourage French fashion designers to relocate to Berlin, but most of them were very patriotic to France, regarded the Axis as the enemy, and quite rightly, and refused to have anything to do with it. With the liberation of France, French fashion responded. And again, Paris became the center of all fashion ideas and the place where everybody else looked to. When did we first see? Let's see if you can remember. When did we first see France becoming the capital of fashion? Can you remember? It was during the Carolingian Renaissance, wasn't it? Oh my goodness, in the Dark Ages. Do you remember? And then, of course, throughout the Middle Ages with the Plantagenets and the Angevin court and all of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, with Louis XVI. So France reclaimed its crown, or should I say couronne, which is the French for crown. I am such a show-off. In the 1950s, and the New Look was launched by Christian Dior. And there it is again, and women loved it. It was voluminous. It used so much fabric, which after rationing was just seen as wonderfully extravagant. It feminized the silhouette by enhancing this hourglass figure, cinched in at the waist and then so full and voluminous below. It was ultra feminine. And it also worked for evening. Just a flight of feminine fantasy. The New Look. But, how new was the New Look really? Remember this? Basically, the New Look is just fashion of the 1850s and 60s, shortened for day, but really not that much different for evening. But think about it. The 1850s and 60s, that was the height of the Victorian era, when women were the most feminine little dolls imaginable, weren't allowed to think for themselves, were they? So it's understandable that Dior went back to an earlier time of heightened femininity for the inspiration for the New Look. The New Look was instantly imitated and knocked off at every level of retail and for every age of woman. Here it is in a store, just a regular store, department store. This is not Dior. Here it is in a catalogue. I think this is what, Lena Lobel, so this is very mid-range retail. Everybody wore the New Look. Look, this is a girl going to her prom in the New Look. And please note her little shoes there. And also note the, actually note everything about this picture. Look at the print on the curtains behind her completely. Those new designs and new patterns. Look at the color of her couch. These gals have got the New Look on. These little girls have got New Look dresses on. Look, a whole line of girls going to their prom in the New Look. You could graduate wearing the New Look. People got married wearing the New Look. So after all the comfort that 1940s fashion offered women, why did they fall so in love with the New Look? Why do you think? Because they wanted to feel feminine again. They had done such a great job in the war. And in this time of peaceful prosperity, that's a tongue twister, peaceful prosperity, they embraced femininity. They wanted to feel little and dainty and gentle and pretty and feminine again. And the New Look responded. Christian Dior really understood that fashion is not an island. What is it? It's a response. And it's a response to the way that people want to feel often. And he tapped in so perfectly to the way that women wanted to feel. Although everyone wore the New Look, very few could afford the real thing. one woman who could is our next style icon, and arguably Dior's biggest client. Meet Eva Peron, also known as Evita. And there she is in a very 1940s get-up. Who was Eva Peron? Well, Eva was born Eva Duarte, a dirt-poor Argentinian peasant girl. She was illegitimate, which, given the era in which she was born and the location in the very Catholic Argentina, was a terrible thing to be and a terrible burden in her early years. So there she was, Eva, this little illegitimate girl out on the pampas of Argentina, but she had a dream. She wanted to make it big. So she moved to Buenos Aires when she was 15 years old, and she did make it big. She wanted to be a movie star. Who doesn't? Come on. And so she started getting work on the radio, and then small parts in films, and then bigger parts in movies. She was a terrible actress. She really had no talent at all, but she was very good at finding the right men to sleep with. She kind of slept her way up the ladder. She was very young, and she was at a charity event. She was sort of a B star. I think she was about 25 at the time when she met this man. He was called Juan Perón, and he was a general in the army. Well, as I'm sure you are aware, Latin American politics throughout the 20th century has been very turbulent, was very turbulent, and still is in some countries. And she met Juan, and they started having a relationship. And almost instantly, the government was overturned. There was a big sort of revolution, and Juan Perón became the president of Argentina. As soon as she realized this was about to happen, she made sure that they got married, so she became the First Lady of Argentina. Can you imagine that? For an illegitimate peasant girl from the pampas of Argentina to become, at age 25 or 26, the First Lady of Argentina. This was incredible. As you can see, she was extremely glamorous as well. So, all in all, this was a big event. This was world news. In 1948, I believe it was, Eva did something extraordinary. She went to Europe on a goodwill tour by herself to secure Argentine relations with Europe, trade relations, that kind of thing. She was the First Lady to do this kind of mission alone. So this was a big step, and she was very excited, and it was headline news. And she arrived in Paris, and this is 48, remember? And everybody made fun of the way she dressed, because look, she was still very much clinging to that kind of 1940s good neighbor policy look. Tropical prints and big hats and flowers. Eva Perón used a lot of the country's money to buy jewelry, and so she wore an awful lot of jewelry very flashily all at once. The French press tore her apart. Now, remembering that Eva loved fashion and was terribly vain and glamorous, this sent her into a fury. But instead of going home in a sulk, legend has it, she read the papers. She was told by her advisors at the Argentine embassy in Paris that she had been ripped apart by the press. And instead of bursting into tears, she said, so legend has it, bring me Dior. So she met with Christian Dior, and he completely revamped her, relooked her, and gave her the ultimate makeover. So Eva and her public image went from being like this to being like this. And this is the Eva Peron we remember. He also instructed her to change her hair. Come on, get rid of those victory rolls, and just to sweep her long dyed blonde hair into a chic chignon at the back of her neck. She was the first public figure to wear the new look in the New World. He also designed her some fabulous iconic suits like this one. And because she and her husband had embezzled much of the nation's money, she had a lot of cash to spend on Dior. This is Eva with her maid or assistant or dresser or somebody like that in just one of the many rooms devoted to her Dior wardrobe. And look at this gown here. Absolutely incredible. Eva Peron really understood that politics and fashion go hand in hand. She hated the middle classes and the upper classes. Why? Because they had been the people who had been so cruel to her when she was an illegitimate little girl. But she loved the workers, the working classes. And although she did embezzle an awful lot of money from the rich, the Perons did an awful lot of good for the poor. It was kind of flashy good, you know, sort of opening new hospitals but then never following it through and finding any doctors to run it, that kind of thing. Giving out large amounts of money to the poor without giving them jobs, this sort of thing. But they did give the Argentine women the vote. The only queen I ever dressed was Eva Peron. A quote from Dior himself. Because for the good or the bad of Eva Peron, she was a queen. I tell you what, her star shone bright, but it did crash and burn very quickly. When she was only about 32, she started to become very ill. She was terribly afraid of doctors, though, so she didn't go for checkup. She didn't go to find out what was wrong with her until it was much too late. And then it transpired she had ovarian cancer. She was the first person in Latin America to receive chemotherapy. That was a new drug, a new treatment available, and she was the first woman in Latin America, I believe, to receive it. Or maybe she was the first woman to be x-rayed. No, that can't be right. Anyway, she was one of the first people to get a famous treatment. It was either chemotherapy or x-ray. But it was all to no avail. Here she is, giving one of her famous speeches, and her husband, Juan, has to hold her up because she is so weak and fragile. She died, and look at her funeral procession. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Millions of her fans and supporters swarmed the streets of Buenos Aires. And then Eva was more or less forgotten until the 1970s, when a concept album of a rock opera came out, written by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, called Evita. Look, an opera based on the life story of Eva Peron. She died in 1952. She was only 33, and the musical sort of follows her life from being a teenage girl on the pampas with big dreams to becoming First Lady and then dying. The concept album was then very quickly turned into a West End musical called Evita. That transferred to Broadway and became a musical on Broadway. And then in the 90s, it was turned into a movie starring Madonna as Eva Peron. God bless Madonna, she does try her best, but she can't act. And I actually figured out why Madonna can't act, why she is always so wooden and unconvincing in movies. I think it is because her whole shtick is an act. Madonna, the persona, is already an act, so trying to layer another character on top of a character she's already created just ends up being wooden. But it is worth seeing because of the costumes. Madonna has more costume changes in Evita than any other actress in any other movie of all time. And many of Eva Peron's outfits, her most iconic suits and dresses, and all of that great Dior stuff is beautifully reconstructed in the movie. And there is Madonna in a scene from Evita, or she's on the set for Evita there, wearing one of these beautiful Dior suits. Recently, Evita was redone, relaunched, revamped, revived, that's the word I'm looking for, on Broadway. And I went to see it actually, and it also featured Ricky Martin, who was fantastic, the handsomest person I've ever seen in real life. Fashion loves Evita because it's so iconic, especially this look of her standing on the balcony of the Casa Rosada, which is the sort of the Argentine answer to the White House, with Argentine flags and microphones, putting her hands up as she addresses the party loyal. And here we have a fashion shoot, obviously inspired by Eva Perón, as is this one. This is actually Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love's daughter, Frances Bean, in a fashion shoot where she is channeling Evita. And there is the real thing in a beautiful Dior gown and evening coat. Considering that Eva Perón was a woman who died in 1952 in a country, you know, that's not America or England or one of these nations that are always in pop culture news. She has really been remembered, which is just as well, because my biggest fear in life is to be forgotten. So I wanted you to be aware of this really incredible woman. So, sticking with the new look, it's not so new anymore, but it's still really pretty. Here is some recent runway that borrows and is inspired by the new look. It is lovely, isn't it? Yet there was another look that marked the decade, so let's meet the second designer of the decade. Hello again. Yes. It's Coco Chanel. Coco, as you know, went into hiding at the end of the war, and we all know why, because she had been very unpleasant and disgusting during World War II, hobnobbing with all of those Nazis. So she went into hiding in Switzerland for a while, but then she had to come out of hiding because nobody hated the new look more than Coco Chanel. She had to come back to Paris, and basically she had to take control of fashion again. And she and Dior had completely different objectives. You can understand why Coco hated Dior. First of all, she hated everyone, didn't she? She hated Schiaparelli, remember? She hated Dior. Because everything he did with the new look ran counter to everything she believed about fashion. Remember, fashion should be wearable, it should be practical, it should be comfortable. A woman should live her life in it. This new look with its girdles and its corsets and all of this fabric and the little shoes, she hated it. So she came out of exile, self-imposed exile, to put things straight. And she put them straight literally with this, the Chanel Cardigan Suit. Boxy, comfortable. You'd still wear a girdle with it, of course, because everybody wore a girdle, but look how comfortable this is. Look how this would flatter anyone. You didn't have to have a tiny waist to look good in this practical, beautiful, elegant, sturdy, workable, livable, practical, all of the key words that mark Chanel, suit. And there it is again, a little bit later, going into the early 1960s. And there it is on a model, so you can see just how elegant it was. American women particularly loved this new silhouette, not the new look, but the alternative silhouette. And women would wear both. In their wardrobes, they'd have Chanel silhouette and they'd have Dior silhouette. And the Chanel cardigan suit was instantly imitated and knocked off at every level of retail and for every age of woman. There it is, in a Sears catalogue. Here it is again. You can see it's the same idea. And there it is again, very boxy. And there it is again. None of these are Chanel. You understand that, right? But this is how fashion functioned then. A designer would create something, then everybody would knock it off and it would become the standard. And as you know, for the following 60 years, every season Chanel offers a tweaked version of the original and proven to be a truly timeless classic. Okay, let's do an anatomy. And we'll use an original mid-century shop mannequin for our anatomy. First things first, squeeze yourself into that girdle. Then add your stockings. Then your tight, uncomfortable little pointed shoes. And then your New Look style dress. Gloves were mandatory. Remember in the 1930s how you couldn't go out without your gloves on? The same is true for the 1950s. As well as your little hat. And we'll give her a little purse, and then, to really make her fashionable, we have to give her the accessory of the 1950s. A poodle, a French poodle. You'll figure out why in a second. But all of those undergarments are also essential for the streamlined silhouette of the 1950s. She needs her little hat, she needs her glove, and what is she missing? Yeah, she needs her own poodle. So the story of mid-century garments could not be told without mid-century undergarments. And people really did dress this way. They really did that. Be they wearing the New Look silhouette, or be they wearing clothing like this, that very long and tapered silhouette. Wow. Men. Menswear in the mid-century era won't surprise you at all, and it can best be described with the title of a best-selling novel of the era. The Man in the Grey Flannel Suit. This is what men of the era wore. They wore their grey flannel suits. They all wore hats. It was all about uniformity, conformity, and they all wore these thin ties. Like this. This is how men dressed. Enough said. So let's visit our first cultural hotspot of this lecture. Paris! Paris was an obsession, especially in the United States, for a number of reasons. One of which was definitely fashion. The re-emergence of fashion from Paris, the New Look. Also, the world sort of got behind France again after its terrible experience during World War II when it was occupied. Paris just became an absolute obsession. Another reason, I think, is because the mid-century, the 1950s particularly, was all about a return to sophistication after the ravages of war, and I think people saw Paris as being a particularly sophisticated place. Okay, this obsession with Paris, of course, we can find it in Hollywood of the 50s. Big Technicolor musicals like An American in Paris. Funny Face, which I hope you've all seen, a wonderful movie about fashion starring Audrey Hepburn and Fred Astaire. Gigi, another movie musical set in Paris. And this weepy romance, The Last Time I Saw Paris, with Elizabeth Taylor. If there's one movie I recommend you give wide berth to, it's this one, The Last Time I Saw Paris. What a stinker. However, you have got to see Funny Face. An American in Paris is also a wonderful movie. So, in Hollywood, we see Paris romanticized incredibly. At the same time, a new philosophy emerged from Paris. Existentialism. French existentialism, it was known as. Basically, it's a philosophy that asks The question, why are we here? Why do we exist? Hence existentialism. And the father of existentialism is Jean-Paul Sartre. It was hot. It was new. Everybody was talking about existentialism and pretending that they understood it. It was cocktail party talk. And then we see all of these sort of bits and bobs and emblems that signify Paris. Excuse me, like the artist's palette. This is a pin, and so is this. The artist's palette was one of the big motifs of the mid-century era. You would see it in costume jewelry, like here. You would see it in print, on textiles, for curtains or dresses. Why an artist's palette? Because that is where the artists are. You know, these images of guys in berets painting on the banks of the Seine. But nothing captured the spirit of Paris more than the French poodle. Poodles are everywhere in the 50s. Here is a little poodle pair, a little poodle couple, just a little ornament there, like this, a poodle. Here is a poodle compact. This is Lucille Ball with the poodle cut. Poodles were everywhere. People were nuts about poodles. Why? Because poodles come from France. They are called French poodles. The poodle cut. I wrote it up there to remind you. And so now you understand why we have the poodle skirt in the 50s. It's not about poodles. It's about Paris. You don't see giraffes on these skirts. You don't see hippopotamus on these skirts. No, you see poodles, because poodles come from Paris. They come from France, the French poodle. Because fashion is never, ever, ever, ever an island. And I just realized that this is the second time we've talked about poodles in this course. Do you remember the first time we talked about poodles? I'll give you a second. No, maybe some of you do remember. I can't forget about Prince Rupert and his poodle boy. Let's talk about suburbia. The move to suburbia launched a whole new genre of fashion merchandising, leisure wear. Now think about it. Although the 1950s was very sophisticated, it was very formal, you wore your hat, you wore your gloves, when you were at home in suburbia, you were allowed to dress in a slightly more casual manner, although you would still be wearing your girdle every day, even to the grocery store. But this sort of clothing started to emerge. Fun, light, items like Capri Pants. Here, for example, Bermuda shorts, especially on guys. Finally, guys could, when they were at home only, they could take off that grey flannel suit and put on a pair of these rather dapper Bermuda shorts in the mid-century era. But please note the shoes and socks with the shorts. That is never a good fashion look. Can't get too informal. It's the mid-century, remember. It's the Cold War. No sneakers, no sandals. You've got your shiny shoes on and your socks, but hey, you're letting your hair down a bit with your Bermuda shorts. Well, during the war years and the years immediately afterwards, there was something called the baby boom. I'm sure you have heard of this, an awful lot of babies being born, and this boom would continue throughout the mid-century era, meaning that by the time we get to the mid-1950s, certainly going into the latter part of that decade, and then into the 60s, we have the invasion of the teenagers. There were more teenagers in America in the 1950s and 60s than ever before. So this meant there was a whole new fashion demographic. Prior to the 50s, there was no such thing as junior wear. Children wore children's clothing until they were old enough to wear adult clothing, and then that was it. The 50s changed all that. Suddenly there was a new fashion demographic, the teenager. So let's take a look at the 1950s teenager. There were two types of attire. Let's look at the nice teen. Like these three girls here. Look, they don't actually have poodle skirts, but she has an Eiffel Tower on her skirt, so that's terribly in keeping with the craze for Paris. And the girl on the right has a glass of champagne, and of course champagne is from Paris. But look, there's a little mouse. Is that Jerry from Tom and Jerry? Drinking from the glass or stirring it or something like that. So very childlike, really, kind of babyish, but fun. But look, they've got high heels on, they have the new look, they have those very pointy breasts, so they have a very adult silhouette. But if you look at the motifs on these skirts, they're really quite childish. A grown-up lady wouldn't have worn a skirt like this. You guys, you would be too old to wear a skirt like this. This was for somebody who was 16, 15 or 16. Look at these girls. They have a new look silhouette, but they're not old enough to wear girdles yet. And here we have these two teenagers in jeans. This is really when the blue jean became the uniform for teens, rolled up at the bottom. Now, this is a very rockabilly look. Why did kids in the 50s roll their jeans up? The answer is so simple, the rolled jeans. Cast your mind back to when you were a child. Do you remember your parents would always buy you clothing that was too big? Because children grow quickly, and so you probably remember as a kid having pants that were too long, and your mum or your dad would roll the hem and then let it down a few months later when you had grown a few inches. This is why teenagers rolled their jeans, but then of course it became a trend unto itself. But nice teenage boys, yes, they could wear jeans, but they also dressed like grown-up men with suits and ties. If they went to a party, a nice teenage boy in the 50s would wear a suit and tie. Remember, it was all about formality, and this extended to the teenager. If you were a nice teenage boy, you would be a letterman with one of these letter sweaters on. This signifies your sorority. Very preppy look. So these are the nice teens. Basically, they're wearing modified adult clothing. Like this. They have the new look silhouette, but it's more girly, it's more childlike. And look at this ad. Coach, unify your lettermen in look-alike awards and sweaters. So these F's symbolize some team, but look at the copy. Shows coordinated team spirit because every letterman wears the same reward. Neatness and uniformity make a better impression. It was about rules. The 50s was all about rules. Fitting in. Far more interesting and iconic, though, is the naughty teen, like these kids here. Grown-ups were actually quite afraid of them because they were in such sheer number. There was a whole genre of movies devoted to the rebel teenager. They're called juvenile delinquent movies, or JD movies. Films like Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause. These were teens out of control. Take a look at them there. They all have these emblematic jackets and their blue jeans. Here they are again, with their leather jackets with the collars turned up, smoking. These were the kids who greased their hair into a pompadour, one of these incredible hairdos that they were always and forever brushing. Look at this guy here. Probably in the Midwest somewhere, but he's a teenage rebel. He has the leather jacket, he has the pompadour haircut. These guys were called greasers. Greasers because of the grease they put in their hair. But there was another kind of teenage rebel called Teddy, the Teddy Boys. Why the Teddy Boys? Because look at their Edwardian style jackets, which were seen as completely outrageous and rebellious at the time because they were nonconformist. Teddy is short for Edward, right? So they were called the Teddy Boys. They had the pompadour greased hair, but they also had these often quite long with velvet collars, Edwardian style jackets and crepe-heeled shoes. But there were also Teddy girls. Look at them. I wouldn't want to mess with them, especially that one on the bike. These were the bad girls. They're so cool, aren't they? And here is another image of a particularly bad girl. She's got her jeans on. She's got her Teddy jacket. Far more interesting and really cool and iconic. Well, nice teen or naughty teen, every teen loved our style icon. Of course, Elvis Presley. And there he is. What a handsome young man. Elvis Presley really was a fashion icon. He was an outrageous dresser. Look what he is wearing here. Of course, he was one of the first rock and roll artists. Grown-ups didn't like that either. Rock and roll. At the very worst, they called it the devil's music. At the very best, they said it was a fad, that it wouldn't last. Well, 60 years later, it did last. And look at the way Elvis is dressed here. This young boy from Tupelo. He was born in Tupelo, Tennessee. And then he moved, of course, to Memphis, Tennessee. And he's wearing something quite outrageous there. Elvis, when he went to school as a teenager, when he was in high school, he wore clothing like this and eyeliner. And he dyed his blonde hair black. And he would get beaten up by the jocks for being so effeminate and strange-looking. But he loved fashion. When he was a teenager in Memphis, he would shop in the African-American neighborhood of town because that's where you got the coolest clothes. And there he is again. As I'm sure you all know, when Elvis suddenly appeared on the scene, he was considered outrageous, particularly because of his rather sexy way of dancing. It was very suggestive, the way he moved his hips. So he was known as Elvis of the Pelvis, and he could only be filmed from the waist up, because below the waist it was too outrageous. But look at what he's wearing there. This was extremely trendy for the 1950s, and young men imitated him. They wanted to dress like Elvis, do their hair like Elvis. And there he is in a leather jacket. And I just had to show you this. Look at this girl with her New Look skirt in which she has appliqued the name of her beloved, Elvis Presley. There is a terrific book, I'm pretty sure we have it at the library, Elvis Fashion, From Memphis to Vegas. Make no mistake, Elvis Presley was one of the most influential fashion icons of the 20th century. When things go wrong, don't go with them. That's a lovely quote from Elvis, but unfortunately, when things started to go wrong for him, he went straight with them and ended up dying at 42 of various kinds of abuse. But really an icon and one of my favorite people. Long live the king. Alright, let's look at another mid-century cultural hotspot. The South Pacific. The craze for Polynesia, Hawaii, the South Pacific, all started when a young Norwegian anthropologist called Thor Heyerdahl sailed a balsa wood raft from the coast of South America to the Pacific, to the Tahitian Islands, and kicked off the tiki craze. At the same time, this book won the Pulitzer Prize, Tales of the South Pacific, by James A. Michener. It is a novel about servicemen and nurses stationed in the South Pacific during World War II. Now remember, the war had just ended, but people were actually starting to feel a bit nostalgic for the years they had spent in service during World War II in the South Pacific doing such heroic things. So all of this conspired. At the same time, Hawaii became a state. An American state, the 50th state. South Pacific was then turned into a musical on Broadway, which became a big hit movie musical, and all of this conspired to launch the tiki craze, this absolute craze for this kind of fake Polynesia. Look at these menus from various restaurants in America. The Kahiki, Johnny's Tiki Hut, the Luau, the Bali High, the Islander. This is where those uptight men in the grey flannel suits and their perfect housewives could go and let their hair down, unleash the savage within by drinking a Mai Tai and putting a plastic lei around their necks. It was fun, it was escapism, it was really the flip side to the obsession with the future and science. And of course it would have a fashion knockoff, the sarong dress. Look at the prints on these sarong dresses. So a sarong dress, as opposed to being a real sarong, it was, as you can see, this kind of slim, tapered, mid-century silhouette, but ruched at the side to give it a kind of tropical feel, often worn with a little bolero jacket. And here you see it again. And look at the way that detail falls down the back. It's almost like a robe à la française, isn't it? And of course, the Hawaiian shirt. This is the era when the Hawaiian shirt, the aloha shirt, was worn by everyone. This counted as leisure wear. The man in the grey flannel suit, that Madison Avenue executive, could go home to his house in the suburbs of Long Island and go native by putting on a Hawaiian shirt. And here's Elvis wearing a Hawaiian shirt in the movie Blue Hawaii, the quintessential tiki movie. But not every young person in the mid-century era loved Elvis. Some were far too cool, far too hip, far too alternative, far too artsy, and far too intellectual for rock and roll. They only listened to jazz. Meet the Beatniks. Who are the Beatniks? Well, the Beatniks were the hipsters of their day. This was the youth counterculture. They were the beat generation. Beatnik was actually a derogatory term. Kind of like we call somebody a hipster today. We're sort of being a bit sarcastic and mean, aren't we? It was the same then if you called somebody a beatnik. You were making fun of them. They were very influenced by the beat writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. They were also completely into Jean-Paul Sartre and French existentialism, which is why they wore French fishermen's jerseys. You know, the striped jerseys, the Breton shirts. Here they are, some Beatniks. What did Beatniks do? Well, these kids would meet in coffee shops, coffee houses, cafes, and listen to beat poetry. They would recite it to each other. And they had a uniform. They wore berets. Kind of a cliche beatnik in his striped Breton shirt and beret and goatee beard. But this is actually how many of them dressed. The guys grew beards, which in a time of clean-cut conformity was outrageous. And he was considered, this guy here, somebody like him, to have terribly long hair. Sometimes men wore sleeveless tops like this. Outrageous. And there she is reading poetry to him in a coffee shop in Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village was the hub of the beat world, of the whole beat scene. And there is a beat chick. Yes, Daddy-o, they used words like chick and cat. They were hip, they were hip, they were happening. Going into the Gaslight Cafe, one of the hubs of the beat scene, where she was probably going to go and listen to beat poetry and bang on some bongos. But Beatniks soon hit the mainstream. Look at this ad. Magnifique! Delightfully different by the Beatnik beret. Of course they wore berets because they were also caught up in the obsession for Paris and France. But they were the counterculture, so their spin on it was berets and existentialism and left bank artsy fartsiness. The cliche beatnik would live in a studio in Greenwich Village, which, believe it or not, in the late 50s, early 60s was one of the cheapest places to rent an apartment in New York. They would live in a studio and they would paint and drink Chianti and put candles in bottles of wine, right, to act as candle holders. And then they would go out to a place like the Gaslight Cafe and they would play bongos and listen to probably some dreadful beat poetry. In the movie Funny Face that I mentioned earlier, there is a great dance scene with Audrey Hepburn, which sort of makes fun of the beatnik. She's dressed as a beatnik here. They also wore black turtleneck sweaters. That was very beatnik. And skinny little pants. And here she's doing a dance and in a cafe. And if you look behind her, one of the chorus boys is dressed up as a beatnik with the beard, with the Bret on top, etc. But the Beats had their poster girl too. And it's somebody so fabulous that I know you're going to fall in love with. Our next style icon of the mid-century era, Jayne Seberg. And there she is, lovely Jayne Seberg. Who was Jayne Seberg? Well, she was a fresh-faced girl from Iowa. And there she is, as a fresh-faced girl in Iowa, and her story is rather incredible. In the late 50s, a very famous movie director was making a remake of Joan of Arc, the tale of Joan of Arc, and he wanted to cast an unknown young actress, a teenager, somebody who would have been Joan of Arc's age, to play the lead. And as sort of a publicity stunt, he did a sort of casting audition, sort of like an American Idol type of affair, throughout America, looking for his Joan of Arc. When he arrived in Iowa, some girls went to audition for him, and he saw this girl, and he thought, ah, that's my Joan. And the first thing he did was cut all her hair off. This changed everything for young Jayne Seberg. The film was a terrible flop. Everybody hated her performance because she was so natural. American critics despised her performance. However, the new French movie directors of the Nouvelle Vague loved her unaffected natural performance and short hair, and she went to Paris and became a huge star there, and then became a huge star in America on the back of being a huge avant-garde movie star in France. And she had a look that was all her own, but soon imitated, especially by the Beat Girls. Look at this short haircut. It has a name. No, it is not called a pixie cut. That is something else. It is called a gamine. Gamine is French for kid. And in France, during this era, children, little girls, had their hair cut very short. So this is called the gamine, the kid haircut. In 1960, Jayne Seberg was cast in her first French movie, Breathless. It's called Au bout du souffle in French, which literally means breathless, and it is an avant-garde art house movie. It's really cool. And in it, she really sports the quintessential beatnik look with the striped Bret on top and the skinny jeans and the gamine hairdo. This really became a trend, a look. And Jayne Seberg took it to absolutely fantastic new heights. She was a very clever young woman. She learned to speak fluent French in 6 months, and in fact she lived the rest of her life in France, with several quite disastrous trips back to the United States, which I'll tell you about in a second. She truly was lovely. She was a huge fashion influence on the kind of young, hip girl. I mentioned that she had some disastrous trips back to America, and they were pretty disastrous. She was a very good-hearted girl. She was an intellectual, very much an intellectual, and she, quite rightly, got behind the civil rights movement. But she aligned herself to the Black Panthers, who were, you know, America's #1 enemy at the time of the American government, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. She aligned herself to the Black Panthers and financed quite a few Black Panther operations. The FBI hated the Black Panthers and decided to make an example of poor Jayne Seberg. They started a campaign of false rumors and lies about her to discredit her. They bugged her phone, they bugged her apartment in Paris, they bugged her parents' house in Iowa. They planted false stories about her in the newspapers, stories that she had been unfaithful to her husband, stories that she was pregnant with Malcolm X's child, everything to discredit her, to humiliate her. And there is a word the FBI use, and it's called neutralizing. They neutralized Jayne Seberg. There is a book about it that came out a couple of years ago. The FBI versus Jayne Seberg, neutralized. They destroyed her life. They truly did. At the height of all of this, she had a miscarriage. She had terrible depression. She tried to kill herself, and eventually, I think she was only about 40. Because they didn't let up, they just carried on doing this for the rest of her life. She did kill herself. Or did she? She was found dead in her car in Paris. And she really had a horrible, tormented life, which started with such incredible promise. But needless to say, fashion loves Jayne Seberg and goes back to her quintessential breathless look time and time again. Yet the woman who really had the biggest influence over what real women wore and how they wanted to look in the mid-century era was not an existentialist, wasn't a hipster. She was a housewife, a married lady, and a mother of 4. This lady. Jacqueline Kennedy, the First Lady of the United States. And look at this gorgeous picture. And there she is with her husband behind her, President John F. Kennedy. Everybody wanted to look like Jackie Kennedy. You have to believe me. She was so lovely. First of all, she was sort of the first beautiful First Lady we'd ever had. However wonderful Eleanor Roosevelt was, she was no looker. Jacqueline Kennedy was chic. She was beautiful. She was groomed. She was stunning, and she had a dress sense that absolutely encapsulated how the well-dressed, sophisticated and elegant woman wanted to look in the early 1960s. And they wanted to look like this. Simple, chic, boxy, bright colors. The only adornment you see there, apart from a big button, is the string of pearls. That was sort of her trademark. Look at this coat. This coat actually belonged to Jackie Kennedy. So beautifully tailored, but so simple, and again in that wonderful bright color. But nobody could do evening quite like Jackie either. Take a look at this. Again, though, see how elegant and simple it is. And everybody wanted to look like her, and I'll prove it to you. She is going for the Jackie look. They are all going for the Jackie look, especially with those pillbox hats and those very boxy suits. They are all going for the Jackie look with the sleeveless shift dress. She's going for the Jackie look. Look at that hair. I wonder who these people are. Do you notice anything else about that mid-century modern picture of that lady in the red dress? Look at the poodle on her mantelpiece. Yes, it all happened. It's all true. She's going for a slightly less classy version of the Jackie look, with her plastic-covered furniture and cigarette in her mouth. However, she's got the same color hair. Lots of women dyed their hair to be the same tone as Jackie, and she has that boxy tailored suit. And also look at the mid-century motif on her curtains, and the color of her couch, and the color of her curtains. It's when you look at real people, I have no idea who these people are in the snapshots that I show you, you can see that all of this really did happen. That was the palette of the mid-century that we looked at earlier, wasn't it? This is a slightly classier embrace of the Jackie Kennedy look. But nobody beat Jackie Kennedy. And here is a lovely quote for those of you who might still be a little too into your Facebook. I want to live my life, not record it. I love that. On November 22nd, 1963, Jackie Kennedy and her husband Jack flew to Dallas. And I think you know what happened. They were on a motorcade driving through the city, lots of cheering fans, and Kennedy was assassinated. And that is the moment of impact. He was shot in the head, and Jackie, just acting instinctively and in shock, climbed on the back of the car to reach for some of his brain and scalp that had, exploded. I can't imagine the trauma that this poor woman went through. And the country went through. Look at that headline. Imagine seeing that. It was a dreadful day. And the pink suit that Jackie is wearing has really gone down in history as being one of the most famous articles of clothing ever, simply because it's so linked in with that dreadful moment. With Kennedy's assassination, the optimistic mid-century era died with him. America, sad and disillusioned with itself, looked beyond its own shores for cheer and inspiration, and by doing so, the 60s as we know it swung into action.